This meeting is being recorded.
Yep. Good morning, everyone. A very happy Republic Day to all. Thank you. Thank you very much. You practiced yesterday's example. Able to design that Netflix screen. So you created all this. I uploaded a zip file. So were you able to create that Netflix screen? Everything working fine? So I already uploaded all the code. Check once. Because we are using lot of Bootstrap now. So make sure that you are using Bootstrap classes, icons, importing Bootstrap files, everything is perfect. First install Bootstrap. After that, link Bootstrap files in styles.css. Then only it will work. Right? Follow that concept of installing, setting up Bootstrap that we discussed already. Now, once we are good with what we designed here, yesterday we learned how to create a simple screen with multiple components. Actually, here we have index component, header component, main component, and register. We can access a component inside another. Application starts with index. Everything comes onto that index. That is why it is called single page. Now, is it having only one page? No, there are several pages. Then why it is called single page application? Single page application is an approach where user will stay on only one page. Actually, traditional web applications, user will move from one page to another. But here, everything can come on to one page. Later, you will learn concept called routing. There you will see more. So this we discussed in the last session, and in the last session, we learned what is the summary. We learned what is component. We learned so how to add component manually. right? And we learned how to add component using CLI commands, right? We discussed about how to add inline and code behind components, right? We learned how to access a component in another. That's we done yesterday, na? That means we can access one component in another. Yesterday we created register. Register component we are accessing in main. Main component we are accessing in index. You can access a component in another component. These are all the basic concepts we discussed up to now related to component. How to create components, adding the components and the hierarchy. Now, today, another major concept we will see about components, that is, we need to understand about data binding. We need to understand about data binding in Angular. We need to know about the concept of data binding in Angular. Actually, what is, see, web development contains lot of techniques. Web designing is completely involved with a lot of techniques. So many techniques you need to learn while developing web applications. For example, actually, there are so many techniques like various web techniques we are having, like data binding. We have like style binding. We have like class binding. We have like routing. We have security. So we have state management like this. So we have like caching like this. So many techniques will be there. So web development contains a lot of techniques. Developing web application is not so simple and easy. So the process is complex. Lot of things you have to take care. That means how user can navigate from one location to another. When user requests anything, how to display it to him. So when user navigates from one place to another place, how to carry his data from one place to another. All these are challenges in web development. So web development requires a lot of techniques. Web development involves a lot of techniques because actually web uses a protocol. Which protocol web uses? HTTP or HTTP? Yes. Do you have any idea about this protocol? What it is called as? Not full form. What it is called as? HTTP is called as a stateless protocol. It is a stateless protocol. Stateless protocol means it can't remember information between requests. That means you done something now and you move to next page. What you done in previous page, next page cannot know. This is the nature of stateless. Then it is very difficult. Suppose you logged in first page and you go to second page. In second page, it logs out. Now your responsibility is to keep that login available for other pages. For that, we use a concept called cookies. Heard about them? These are all techniques. Without these techniques, web development cannot happen. So data binding is one technique. Like that, so many techniques you are going to learn here. So what is data binding technique? Data binding is nothing but data binding is a technique used in web applications, where the data is accessed from source and binded to UI. Data is accessed from the source and binded to UI. And very important is actually it identifies the changes in UI and update back to source. This is called data binding. So in every web technology, data binding is compulsory. Everywhere we need data binding. Data binding is nothing but accessing the data from source and binding to UI. For example, suppose we have some username. Suppose username, a text box is present. And here, suppose we are having a div. And what we want here is, so whatever value they entered in this username, some value they entered in this username text box, this value we need to collect and display here in the div. That means what is the source text box? From text box, we need to collect the value and we need to display in a paragraph, in a div, in a span or somewhere. You need to bind to UI. Or actually, it may come from, suppose you have a variable. From this variable, there is a value John. This is source. Now this value must be attached to text box. This value must be attached to text box. That is text box is UI. And any change they make in that value, it should update back here. That means it should update back here. This is data binding. There is data stored in some location. We need to display the data in UI. And from UI, user can make changes in the data. We need to collect the changes and update back to the source. This mechanism is data binding. How you do this in general JavaScript? How you do this in general JavaScript? In JavaScript, how you will collect value from a variable and attach to text box. You are thinking or waiting for my answer? Huh? I asked you a question. How we can access data from a variable and attach to a text box? In JavaScript, how do we do that? So for that, actually, to do this, we need lot of DOM methods. Am I right? You learn DOM methods: get element by ID, get query selector, right? You have to access and you need to bind. Generally, what we do is, for example, for this text box, we have an ID as txt name. Then generally how we do that? So document dot get element by ID, get element by ID. What is it? Txt name dot value is equal to what? Username. That's how we do. How you will update back to username if they done any change? How you will update back? If they done any modification in this name, how you will update back? How do we know whether they modified or not? Then for that, actually, we need to write a function. Actually, for that, so function, actually for that, suppose a function name changed. Am I right? We need to use a function. Here I'm just displaying. So we need to write one function. We need to write a function. What is it? Name change. When this function will fire up? When input type text on change. On change, or you learned so many events on key up, on blur, on focus, on change. So many events are there. That means on change, which function should call? Name change. Name change. What is this known as? This is known as what? Event. We need event. And how we can update that? For that, we need to use document dot get element by ID or something. Actually, this is DOM method. So data binding in JavaScript, jQuery, everywhere happens by using lot of DOM methods and events. By using DOM methods and events, we do this. But one advantage is actually JavaScript and jQuery handles data binding by using lot of DOM methods and events. Lot of DOM methods and events. JavaScript and jQuery handles data binding by using lot of DOM methods and events. We have to use lot of DOM methods and events. But one specialty is Angular is completely decoupled from DOM manipulations. Angular is completely decoupled from DOM manipulations. Here you never need DOM methods. You never need any DOM methods. No DOM methods are used here. So without using any DOM methods, we can manage everything. So Angular is completely decoupled from DOM. So yes, please, who is that? You please go out, Mr. Busy Guy. We are more busy than you, man. Please get out and talk outside. Attending Angular like technologies, little bit common sense also should be there. Huh? Right. Keep your cell phone silent. You know, in mobiles, there is a silent mode. You know, some people even don't know that. They just have mobiles. They don't know how to use mobiles. Huh? Have some common sense. For 1.5 hours, keep your mobiles in silent mode. If don't know, bring it. I will show how to put in silent mode. Huh? For 1 hour, can't you bear this? Right? Yeah. Let's continue. So Angular is completely decoupled from DOM manipulations. It doesn't require any DOM methods. No DOM methods. That means element by ID, tag name, anything not required. Then how it will manage transferring data? If DOM methods are not there, then how it will manage from where to collect data, where to show data? How it will manage? Any idea? You learned any software technology? You learned any software technology which can manage without writing functions and all? No. Actually, how Angular manages this without writing functions and all? Actually, Angular implicitly uses frameworks like MVC. Heard about it? Model View Controller, MVC, and MVVM, Model View and View Model. It uses the frameworks like MVC and MVVM. So these MVC and MVVM frameworks will handle data binding. They will handle data binding. So what is the specialty of a framework? Framework have inbuilt functions and methods. So you just tell what and from where you want, it will handle internally. What is technically a framework? Actually, framework is a set of libraries. So a set of libraries with implicit, you can say with implicit flow, controlled for application, flow controlled for application. I told you in the beginning, if you remembered in introduction, difference between library and framework. Remember, library cannot control the application flow, but framework can control application flow. Framework can control application flow. So Angular will not use any DOM methods. Then without using DOM methods, how it can handle? Internally, it uses frameworks called MVC and MVVM. Now I will give you a small introduction on this. What is MVC and how this MVC framework works? What is MVVM? How that MVVM works, right? When we know this, then only we can implement, right? So in Angular, to implement data binding, we need to know the concept of MVC and MVVM. Let's see how it works. Actually, first I will give you a small outline on what is MVC. We will see a simple outline because MVC is both client side, server side. You are learning client side. When you learn Java, .NET, there also you will have MVC. Java uses MVC by name Spring MVC. .NET uses MVC by name ASP.NET MVC. PHP uses MVC by name Code Igniter, and PHP uses by name Cake PHP. Python uses by name Django. Django, people call Django or Django. So MVC is used both client side and server side. Actually, MVC is nothing but MVC. It is an software architectural pattern. It is an software architectural pattern. What is meant by software architectural pattern? What is meant by software architectural pattern? A software architectural pattern can build application and control the application flow. Actually, for that, I will tell you one small point here. See, actually here, when we are dealing with software development, generally in software development we have design patterns and software architectural patterns. In software development, you have to know about two things very important: design patterns and architectural patterns. For example, I will tell one general example. Suppose we have a game like chess game. You don't know how to play chess, and you purchased a book from the market written by some grandmaster, some world grandmaster champion of chess. He written a book on chess, how to play chess, and you read the book. You learned how to play chess from the book. You learned all the rules. You know perfectly everything, how every piece moves. You know all the rules and regulations. You perfectly learn chess. With this knowledge, can you play with other experienced people in any chess tournament? Why can't you learn chess? You learn chess perfectly. You know everything. Then why can't you play with the people, with experienced people in chess tournaments? Because the point is nothing but people who are playing that game from several days, they have some tricks. They implement those tricks on you. Very important. I will show you simple. For example, I will show here. Suppose we have a tic-tac-toe game. In this tic-tac-toe game, suppose my move is here. My opponent move is here. Then I will guarantee that I am going to win the game now. Compulsory. Nobody can defeat me now. We can challenge. Why? Because now we have certain trick. We will follow the trick. What is the trick? My next move will be here. Then his move must be here. My next move will be here. Finish. I can close the game here. I can close the game here. Am I right? That means now I have some plan. I have some tricks. Why I am applying this plan on that person? Because this plan is already tested, already proven. If it is already tested and proven, do it. Why you are wasting your time? Understood? Software development is also same. Software development is also same. Actually, you are building a application for some finance domain, means bank. When you are building an application for finance domain, you cannot build it in the same way how you built it for an ERP domain. ERP means enterprise resource planning. That means like some shopping. For shopping, you developed an app. For bank, you developed an app. Both are little different. Bank related to finance domain and shopping related to ERP domain. Lot of rules, lot of technical issues will be there. Now, without knowing all those, you blindly start developing an app with whatever you learned. Then at certain stage, you will face lot of issues. To overcome these issues, what software developers will do? Software developers will follow the patterns, so which are already tested and which are already proven. In software development, we have certain patterns. These patterns will guide the developers to accomplish any task successfully. Developers follow these patterns and build application. Without following the patterns, if you start building application, then it will fail. For example, you are learning Java, .NET, Angular, some technology. You got some errors in your program. You copy that error and Google. And in Google, you see a lot of answers posted about it. Am I right? How they know you will come with this error? How they know that you will come with this error? That means they already faced that problem. And they know that the same approach you will also follow. And they will tell you solution that generally everybody follows the same. You might also follow the same. Please don't do that. Follow this way. Then you will get solution. That means why there are so many answers already posted, because everybody knows that he will follow in the same steps and come here. Then from there we will guide him saying that, okay, up to this you came, from here don't do like this, go in this way, it will be solved. That means software development is not just show whatever you learned. Software development is about follow the footsteps of the people who built it successfully. Don't try innovations in a certain domain. When you try innovations, you try to invent some new things, then you will face a lot of problems. That is what actually design patterns. So in software development, there are how many design patterns? I hope you learned somewhere. Actually, in software development, there are 23 design patterns. 23 design patterns. We call them as gang of four, GOF, gang of four patterns. These 23 patterns are categorized into three groups. We have creational patterns, we have structural patterns, we have behavioral patterns. So software development is all about these patterns. Suppose you are building a module for a customer, then you have to follow some patterns. You are building a module for admin, then you have to follow some different approach, because admin needs authorization, authentications and all. Customer doesn't require any kind of editing of values and all. He need to just view. That means when we are building a project, we have to follow a lot of design patterns. Actually, creational patterns are about creating objects. Structural patterns are about creating, you can say designing. They are about designing classes. Behavioral patterns are about communication, how objects communicate with class. I will tell you one example. Suppose you learned for each, am I right? This for each is an iterator. We call it iterator, na? Iterator is name of a software design pattern. Iterator is the name of a software design pattern. Do you know what is difference between loop and iterator? Loop and iterator. Actually, loop loop requires initialization. Loop requires condition. Loop requires counter. Am I right? But iterator doesn't require. Iterator doesn't require initialization, condition, counter. That means you saw in JavaScript you have for, where, item, of, collection. Am I right? That means what it will do, it will read every item from the collection. Every item from the collection. This is iterator. If I want to read every item from collection using loop, then we have to write like this: for where I is equal to how much? 1. I less than or equal to how much? Collection dot length. Am I right? We need to write I plus plus. I hope you know this. Huh? That means a loop requires initialization, condition, counter. But iterator doesn't require. It will start from beginning, it will end at end. It will proceed to next automatically. You don't need a condition, you don't need an initialization, you don't need a counter. So iterator is a software design pattern which reads elements from a collection in sequential order. This iterator actually belongs to behavioral pattern. It belongs to behavioral pattern. Behavioral pattern indicates communication. So it communicates with the collection. It checks how many elements are in collection. It reads that element. After reading first element, it will again communicate with the collection. It will check second one. It will read second one. It's a communication pattern. So till now in your software development, you have used a lot of patterns. You don't know. You have used a lot of patterns, but you may not know that those are design patterns. Iteration is a design pattern. If anybody asks what is the purpose of iteration, sequentially accessing elements from a collection. That is what the purpose of iteration. I hope you people learning Java, .NET like technology heard about singleton. Singleton pattern means you design a class in such a way that it can have only one object. That is a design pattern. That's a design pattern. Singleton is a design pattern. For example, you learned about events, na? On click and all. In JavaScript, you might have learned about events. Do you know event follows a pattern called observer? Event follows a pattern called observer. It is also a communication pattern. That means it comes under which category? Behavior. You have learned about in class, you learned about constructor. Am I right? Constructor is a design pattern. Constructor is related to creational. That means it is responsible for creating object. Na? So everything is design pattern in software development. And especially if you are having experience, 5-10 years experience in software development, in companies, they ask specially, do you have complete idea on design patterns? Because at the role of team lead, project lead, you must be very good in design patterns. Because you need to tell for this module which pattern they have to follow. Then your developers will follow the pattern and build that module. For every concept, we need that. That's the reason Java developer, .NET developer, and all these people, you Google, you see Naukri sites. When you see team lead, project lead, like roles, you search Java team lead, Java project lead. You will see in every requirement, design patterns compulsory. Design patterns compulsory, right? You should know all the design patterns because that is what application is used for. That means, remember, design patterns are responsible for which purpose? They are responsible for building what? App. Okay, application built. But how this application runs, flow, from where to start, from where to collect data, where to send the data, flow. Flow cannot be controlled by design patterns. Design patterns can build application, but they cannot control the flow. Design patterns can build application, but they cannot control the flow. Then to control the flow, we need another patterns. We call them as architectural patterns. Architectural patterns have a broader scope than design patterns. Design patterns allows to build application because design patterns deal with creating objects, designing classes, and handling communication. By using these patterns, what you can do, you can build an app. But how to control the flow of app? From where to access data, where to show the data, from where to start, where to end, how you will control the flow. You need another pattern. We call them as what? Architectural pattern. And there are so many architectural patterns. I will show you here. There are so many software architectural patterns, design patterns, different categories are present. So I will show you what are those different patterns available. You can see actually design patterns and architectural patterns. These are design patterns. This is design pattern. Design patterns are the solutions to the software design problems that you will find again and again in real world development. Actually, design patterns, we have three design patterns, gang of four. Three categories: creational, structural, and behavioral. So these are creational patterns. These are creational patterns. Abstract, factory, builder, factory method, prototype, singleton. These are called creational. These are structural patterns. Structural patterns deal with designing of classes. These are all structural patterns. Adapter, bridge, composite, decorator, facet, flyweight, proxy. And these are behavioral patterns. Behavioral pattern deal with communication. These are all behavioral patterns. Chain of responsibility, command, interpreter, iterator, mediator, memento, observer, state, strategy, template method, all these. Now, are they enough in software development? No, they are not enough. So you learned Java, .NET, PHP, Python, and you went to company for a job. First question they will ask, okay, you learned Java, .NET, PHP, which architectural pattern you learned? Which architectural pattern you learned along with this? Because you will not fit as a software developer in real-time company without knowledge of architectural pattern. Java is not enough, .NET is not enough, PHP not enough, Python not enough as a software developer in real-time project. You need knowledge of an architectural pattern. And these architectural patterns, you see, these are all architectural patterns. Blackboard system, broker pattern, event-driven architecture, implicit invocation, layers, microservices, MVC, MVP, MVVM. I hope in Java, .NET, and like technologies, you heard about MVC and microservices. Without that, no Java developer. Without those architectural patterns, you will not be eligible as a software developer. Every software developer should have knowledge of design patterns and architectural patterns. That means it's not just building application. You need to control the application flow. So you learned Java and went to job for in any company interview. First question they will ask, which architectural patterns you learned along with Java. You should say microservices or MVC Spring. PHP people will talk about Cake PHP code igniter. Python people talk about Django Flask. .NET people talk about ASP.NET MVC. These are all architectural patterns. What is MVC now? MVC is an what kind of pattern? Design pattern or architectural pattern? Architectural pattern. That means it is responsible for both building the application and controlling the application. Controlling the application flow. So it is responsible for doing both things. Actually, the concept of MVC was originally introduced by Trygve in the early 1970. In the early 1970, this is Trygve. We call him father of MVC. He introduced the concept of MVC. MVC is not a new concept. It's very old, 1970. The first technology with MVC was Smalltalk. Smalltalk is the language that first used MVC. After that, every technology started using this MVC. These are all the various technologies using MVC. PHP uses MVC by name Cake PHP code igniter. Java uses MVC by name Spring. Perl uses MVC by name Catalyst and Dancer. Python uses MVC by name Django, Flask, Grok. Ruby uses MVC by name Ruby on Rails. JavaScript uses MVC, Angular, JS, Spring, JavaScript, MVC, Spine. And .NET uses MVC, ASP.NET MVC. Every technology is using MVC. Angular is also using MVC. Angular is also using MVC. Now, how this MVC works, we will see. That makes everything simplified. Let's see how this MVC is going to work. So, what is it? Is an architectural pattern. What is an architectural pattern can do? Architectural pattern, a pattern can build application, can build and control application flow. Application flow. That means it is same like design pattern, but have broader scope. It will have broader scope. It is responsible for both building and controlling the application flow. Actually, Trygve introduced MVC in early 1970s with Smalltalk language. So actually, MVC is now originally designed for desktop applications. It is designed for desktop applications, but now it is used in web applications. We use this in web applications. Actually, it was designed for desktop. And every technology knows MVC, knows and uses MVC. Every technology knows and uses MVC. So Java uses MVC by name what? Spring MVC. Python uses MVC by name Django, Flask, like Grok, like this. Ruby or say PHP uses MVC by name Cake PHP and code igniter, like that. Igniter. Python, Java, PHP, .NET uses MVC by name like ASP.NET MVC. So Ruby uses MVC by name Ruby on Rails. Perl uses MVC by name Catalyst and say Dancer. So various technologies. JavaScript uses MVC by name Spine. And like so many are there now. Angular is using Angular JS is using, Backbone is using, all these. These are all MVC. So technically MVC is an software architectural pattern, and very important here. So the architecture. So MVC architecture. MVC architecture is nothing but MVC. It separates application into three components. We have model, and we have view, and we have what? Controller. MVC separates application into three parts: model, view, controller. Actually, model represents data, and view represents UI, and the controller represents the controller represents application logic, So where data is present? In model. Where it is shown? In view. And where it is processed? Controller. That means model contains data, view displays the data, and the controller is responsible for controlling the entire flow. Remember, I am just giving a brief overview, not detailed into it. Detailed into MVC means it will take a lot of time. We are not learning MVC. We are learning a technology which is using MVC. Understood? So if we have to learn MVC directly, there are so much things to discuss. So I am not doing that, because here Angular is using MVC. So you need to just know for which purpose it is using MVC and where it is using MVC. Angular is using MVC in data binding. That means Angular handles MVC in data binding. That means what is this MVC framework? Actually, what is the concept of that MVC framework is, generally, suppose we have the entire application separated into three components. It is separated into three components. So one is what? Model. Another one is what? View. Another one is what? Controller. Actually, in our Angular, this model represents data. Data in our Angular is present in the format of JSON. I told you now. It is in the format of JSON. And view describes the UI. UI is nothing but this is your .html. Controller defines the logic. It is your .ts. Understood? That means now what happens is, whatever data present in the model, it is accessed by controller, and it will send the data to the view. If any change, remember, data will not directly go from model to view. It always processed by whom? Controller. And controller will send the data to UI. And if any modification in UI, it is updated back to where? Controller, and it will send it to model. It will update that into the model. So we need data, we need a controller, and we need UI. Already you have TS file, that is your controller. Understood? Already you have your HTML file, that is view, that is your view. Data you can keep bring from anywhere. Actually, it will come from database, and actually this data come from APIs. We will learn that. Backend technologies will communicate with the database, get the data, convert the data, and provide the data in the format of JSON. That data we can present. Here we will see this concept now. Let's see. Let's add one component here. Let's add a new component. In the components, I will open in terminal ng generate component data binding. Okay. Skip test. I will use skip test. I don't want to generate test file. Okay. Data binding component is added. After it is added, we will keep it in the startup. Go to app module. In Bootstrap, we will set which component? Data binding. Data binding component. It is actually data binding component. Okay. Now, one more in index, I need to change. So it is app. So data binding. App data binding. Okay. App data binding. And you can see here data binding works. We created a component and it is working. Now let's design. Let's go to data binding component now in the TS file. So here we have the TS file. Now data will come here. How to bring data from external sources, I will teach you in a separate session. Currently, temporarily, we will put some data directly in controller. Later, we will bring from another location, right? Initially, we will put some data directly in controller. From controller, we will send the data to view. Actual data comes from where? Model, right? Now, temporarily, how to store data in a class? In a class where data is stored. What are class members? We discussed in TypeScript. What are TypeScript class members? TypeScript class members. What are TypeScript class members? Properties, methods, constructor, another one, accessor. In these four members, where data can be stored? In these four members, where data is stored in properties. So we will create a property called username. It is what type? String, and we will initialize some value. We will put some value into this. This is some data we are having. Now this data we need to display in the UI. Go to HTML page. In HTML page, I will just create a div. So class as container fluid, because we are using Bootstrap. Here, I will just keep a heading. In this, I will write hello. After that, here I will put a span. Here I want to display that value. Whatever username they entered, we need to display. Actually, if it is JavaScript, already we know. We have to write event body onload. Event is required now. Body onload get element by query selector. Which one? Span. In that inner HTML. In the span inner HTML, we have to get value from variable name. Which variable name? It is not variable, property name. What is the property name? The property name is username. So here, very simple. You need to use a binding expression, double colon, double semicolon. This is curly brace. And here you have to just use username. That's it. That's it. That means it will get that value and it will display. That's very simple. No events, no DOM methods, nothing. If I have to do the same in JavaScript, lot of work. You know JavaScript, right? Now this is very simple. You just pull the data and display them. For that, we need a data binding expression. Here, a lot of concepts are there we will learn. This is simple. Are we using any DOM methods? Are we using any events? Without that, how it is working then? Internally, it is using a framework called MVC. MVC identifies identifies this is view. Actually, this refers to view. This view verifies where the data is present. Understood? Currently, data is in which location? Controller. In controller, we have username. Username is having some name. Then it is identifying where the data is present and it is accessing and displaying here. Actually, we can bring this from another location. From where we can bring this, we can bring from model. But later I will show you how we can create a separate data, access that and use it. Now here, this is actually data binding. That means here, remember, actually Angular uses MVC framework for data binding. It uses MVC framework for data binding. And here, very important, data binding is classified into two types. Data binding is again classified into two types. We have one-way binding and we have two-way binding. Two types of data binding is there. One-way binding is nothing but accessing the data from source and display in the UI. That is one way. Two-way binding means again identify any change happened in the view and update back to the source. Some technologies don't support two-way binding. That is why Angular is famous than other technologies in terms of two-way binding. That means one of the main competitor for Angular, React don't have two-way binding. React have only one-way binding. Then to handle two-way binding, they need to implement a lot of techniques, lot of external efforts. But Angular doesn't require. Angular internally handles two-way binding. That means one of the main difference in data binding between Angular and React uses only one-way binding technique. To handle two-way binding, you need a lot of explicit logic. But one of the great advantages of Angular, it supports two-way binding. Internally, it will manage this. Many technologies don't have two-way binding. Actually, before Angular, which class? What is the time? Right. We have two options, one-way binding and two-way binding. What is the concept of one-way binding is it can access the data and display, but it cannot identify changes and update back. It cannot identify the changes and update back. That is the problem with two-way, one-way. And React and other technologies don't do that. For that, we need extra effort. Actually, before Angular, we used very popularly a technology called Knockout.js. Knockout.js, Backbone.js, Ember.js, which are even today popular in companies. So don't think that all companies are using Angular or React. Many companies are using some scripts and frameworks which are not Angular React. Several companies are still working on Knockout Backbone. Actually, when single page applications popularity started, single page applications first were built with very popular technology called Knockout.js. We thought that Knockout.js will make a good trend in the market. Actually, we delivered training on Knockout.js for software developers in companies when Knockout.js came. And we thought that this will make a good revolution in the market. But suddenly Google released Angular.js, and Angular.js came with a lot of features which were lacking in Knockout. Knockout uses only one-way technique, and Angular came with two-way, then everybody started migrating towards this. So even today, several MNCs projects are still in Knockout.js, right? So that means you, as an Angular developer, don't think that you will fit in every project. Some companies' projects don't need Angular people. You are a Java developer, .NET developer, but their projects are 5-7 years back projects, 10 years back projects. You have to still work on them. In that case, they don't need Angular React. They need old techniques, right? So that is the reason you need to know the differences. So data binding have two concepts, one way and two way. I will show you both. First, we will say one way binding. What is one way binding? What is the concept of one way binding? The concept of one way binding is nothing but it is the process. It is the process of accessing data. It is the process of accessing data from source and binding to UI, binding to UI, binding to UI. It is the process of accessing data from the source and binding to the user interface, binding to the UI. And very important is it will not update the changes in UI to source. It will not update the changes in UI source. It will not do that. This is one-way binding technique. One-way binding technique. I will show you the concept here. Means we will see that. For example, observe carefully. So I will write here. There is a property declared already. Which one? What is it? Username. I am displaying here. I will say one-way binding. Okay. Here I am adding username. Input type is equal to text. In this text box, let's go in this text box. We want to display that username. And the same username we want to display somewhere below. I will put a break and put here some hello. And we put a span here. I will directly not display. I will use some spans and all. Here also I want to display. Now see, we want to display the same data in two locations. Then in text box, how to display? You know, text box have a property called value. In that value, we are displaying what is it? Username. We are displaying that username. And the same username we are displaying here. We are displaying username here. Now you can see it is accessing and displaying that username in both. Actually, this data is coming from username, and that username is what? John. That means this is the data coming from that username. Right? The data coming from the username. This is the data coming from the username. The same data is displayed here. The same data is displayed here also. Now let's do one thing. If I do any modification here, it should update back. It should update back into that variable. If it is updated back into variable, that should reflect here. Na? Am I right? Let's try. I will click here. I will try to type, not working. It's not working. It's not updating back. If it is updating back, then it should display that name below. It's not updating. That means this is one direction only. That means it is accessing data from the source and displaying. Any modification is not updating. This mechanism is called as what? One-way binding. We call that mechanism as one-way binding. It is the process of accessing data from source and binding to UI. It will not update the changes in UI to source. That is one-way binding. So here so many techniques are there. So you can bind the value, you can bind the value by using various binding techniques. How we can, in one way binding, how you can bind the value using that, we have various binding techniques. What are the binding techniques? You can bind, one binding technique is attribute binding, another technique is property binding, another technique is interpolation. These are three techniques. How you can bind value to UI? In one way, the source is binded to UI. In how many ways you can bind? There are three ways: attribute binding, property binding, interpolation. Actually, interpolation is nothing but interpolation is the process of binding a value by using data binding expression double curly brace. If you are binding any value by using this double curly brace, then it is called as interpolation. We call that mechanism as interpolation. We call that as interpolation. Right? Now you see here currently, so we will put a logic like this, syntactically like this. For example, public username, and it is what type? String is equal to some value. And here we have a text box, input type text. In that we have a value. To that value we are using, what is it? Username. So, or in a span you are displaying that username. Am I right? Span or div, anywhere you are displaying this username. Now this mechanism is interpolation. We call this as interpolation. Interpolation is nothing but binding a value by using data binding expression. Data binding expression is double curly brace. Now what is problem in this is, this is okay, it is binding, you saw that data is displayed. But what is problem with interpolation is, actually interpolation is forward only and renders, so, and one time only. It is forward only and one time only. Interpolation is forward only and one time only. This is interpolation. We call this, this is the problem of interpolation. Interpolation is forward only and one time only. What does that means? I will show you. Let's see. For example, here you can observe here, interpolation is forward only and one time only means, observe here. See, what does that means? I will do one thing. First, I will give you this example. Already this example you can try. No need to give the code. This you will write in which location? .ts. This will write in HTML. You create a component there, you can do these things. Interpolation I will show you here actually. Suppose, so this is interpolation. Suppose here we are having a property. So public, a property is stock, is a Boolean type, and it is having Boolean type, and it is having true or false. Currently it is having, suppose, false. Now I have to bind this to a checkbox. I am writing a data list, data term, some stock, and the data definition. Here we have input type is equal to checkbox, and here we will put some available like this, just a message we are giving. Now you can see this is, I need to bind this Boolean true or false to this checkbox have a property called checked. Na? It have a checked property, checked. To the checked property, I am applying using binding expression. What is it? I have to apply this value. What is it? Stock. Checked is actually what? False. Checked is actually false. Then here you can see it is checked. It is checked. That means you see here we are using stock. It is false actually. It is false. And the value coming here, checked, is expecting a Boolean value, true or false. And when I pass it here, you can see it is false. And for example, see now what I am doing here is suppose you see this is changed. This is changed to true. This is changed to true. Is changed to true. Actually, checked is changed to true. By default, it is what? True. You can see it is true. And if I changed this, to what? False. That means the checked should be disabled. Na? It is not disabling. It is once updated, checked. It is not removed. One direction only. And one time only. It is one time only. It is not updating. It is not changing. Value is updated. For example, you see here, value means how it will update the value. I will show you. Suppose I'm giving here another example here like this. What we will do, we will put temporarily stock. Okay, na? Temporarily stock value is what? It is false. But it is not affecting on this element. On this element, it is not affecting. You see now, I changed this. I changed this actually to true. Now you can see it is showing here true. But false and true are no effect on this checked property. They are not working on that HTML. So interpolation doesn't suit here. Interpolation doesn't suit here. Interpolation is okay in text box. You saw text box working now. Text box, whatever value you entered, it is updating there. It is displaying. The interpolation is working for text box value, but it is not working for checked. It is not working. Always it is checked. Even you give true or false, it is always checked. So interpolation doesn't suit for every element. Every element. Then how do you bind with this checkbox? Then we use another technique called interpolation is forward only and read only. That means suppose, so syntactically we have public. What is it? Stock. What is type? Boolean type. Here it is what? True. So true. And we are binding with what? Input type what? Checkbox. Checkbox have what? Checked. Into the checked we are applying. Into the checked we are applying what? Stock. In this situation, what happens is not is. So checked property, checked attribute will not update the Boolean. Will not update the Boolean. It will not update the Boolean or assign Boolean. Understood? It will not update the Boolean or assign Boolean. It will not assign also. You set false, it is not assigning. So interpolation is not suitable for every element. Interpolation is not suitable for every element. For every property, it is not suitable. Then what we have to do is we need to use another technique. We have to use property binding. We need to use property binding. Property binding is nothing but it allows to bind any value to element to any, it allows to bind value to any element. But what is the advantage is it keeps the value updated. Understood? It keeps the value updated. And generally property binding is defined by specifying the property name in square brace. You have to put property name in square brace. We have to put the property name in square brace. That means we have to write like this: input type is equal to what? Checkbox, and the property is checked like this. Here we have to apply that stock. Now it will work. You should not use interpolation. Interpolation is by using expression double curly brace. It is okay. It is working for text box. It will work for some elements, but some properties it cannot work. Then what we have to do? We have to bind by using a property binding technique. So here we need to use property binding technique. For example, now tell me here. So this will work fine. I will show you. Let's see. Now, Boolean is true. I will not use here interpolation. Interpolation is not working. Then what we will do is we will use property binding, square brace. What it is? Checked into that what? Stock. And it is actually what? Stock is true now. If stock is true, that means it is selected. Let's change the stock. Here we will set it to what? False. We will set it to false. Then you can see it is deselected. It is working fine now. Interpolation will not work everywhere, but interpolation is also a binding technique. In some elements, some properties, we can use interpolation, but not for every property. So in that case, we have to prefer using what? Property binding. So property binding is defined. Suppose I set it to what? True. Then automatically it will bind there. You can use for text box. Suppose we have public username. Username is what type? String. Suppose John and John. And here what we are doing is we are giving another data term, name, and the data definition. Here we have input type is equal to what? Text. If you want to bind, you can use value in square brace. And what is that value? What is it? Username. And you can see it is also working here same. We can use binding expression here, or we can use property binding. So which one is preferable? We can prefer property binding, but expression is also required sometimes. For example, if checkbox is checked, then it should display available. Stock is true, it should say available. If stock is false, it should say out of stock. That means this string should change. Then what we do? We can put a binding expression. Here we can write an expression. What is the expression? Stock is equal to what? True. Question mark. It is what? Available. Otherwise, we will put as what? Out of stock. Like this we are writing. We are displaying like this. You know, this is ternary operator, na? Right? We are writing like this. That means it will display that. So available. Suppose I am changing the value here. I am changing the value as what? False. I change the value to false. Then it will be saying out of stock. It is changing. But remember, it is only one-way binding. If I select this, it should be showing available now. It is not updating back. Why? Because it is still which way binding? One-way binding. If it is two-way binding, it will update back and it will immediately show that available. But it's not working. It's not working means it is one-way binding only. Currently, you are learning only one-way binding. You can bind to using expression You can bind by using properties. So such evaluations you have to do, then you need a binding expression. You need a binding expression. Otherwise, you have to just use property binding. Property binding. But here one problem is there in property binding. The problem is nothing but property binding problem is nothing but every element don't have all the properties that are available as attributes. Every element don't have all the properties that are available as attributes. What does that means? It means that, for example, you learnt a table in HTML. Table in HTML, we can give table height some 200 pixels. You can give table width how much? Some 300 pixels. We can give table border, suppose 1. Like this we give an option. But actually, suppose I want to control the table dynamically. If I want to control the table dynamically, suppose you know where we will use table document dot which element? Create element. Which element we are creating? Table. This is in HTML creating a table. After creating table, we want to apply width for table. We will put 300. We want to apply height for table. We will keep here what? 200, but it will show error. Error because height is not a property. It says that height is available in HTML as attribute, but in JavaScript it is not there. In JavaScript, table don't have height. There is no height property. Then how you will control the height dynamically? I want to control the height dynamically, but table don't have height as a property, but it is available as attribute. In HTML, height will work, but in JavaScript, height will not work. That means now see here, we are defining that. For example, you see, you already know your HTML, right? Suppose you have your HTML page. We have a table. Table will have a table row, table cell, some name, something. Table have border 1. And you can see this is a general HTML table. And in this HTML table, we are having table. You can see table is having this. For table, observe, I am giving width. I am giving width as 200 and table width is adjusted to 200. I am giving table height. Height is also 200. And you can see table height also 200. Height is there. In HTML, table have height, but in JavaScript, we don't have. Dynamically, we can't have height. Then how to control height? So we don't have height. Let's try here. We don't have height dynamically. Then how do we control the height? I will show you. Actually, suppose here I am designing. This is interpolation. Let me give this example. Copy. First example I will give this is what? Data binding dot component dot ts. In the data binding component dot ts, this is the code. Another one is data binding dot component dot html. In that HTML, this is the code. Roughly, I am giving this first for your understanding. Now let's do this here. I will go here and I will create two properties. So one is public t width. T width is table width. It is what type? Number type. I will give 300. Okay. And again, another one is t height. Table height is also number and it is 200 pixels. Now what happens? Now here we will create one table. Means here we are using a table. That means here we will say attribute. Now you see here I am writing a table. For the table, we are already giving border. Border I am giving as one border. In the table, we have a row. In that we have a cell, some username, something like this. And you can see this is the table we have. Now for this table, I am giving width as a property. Width as a property, this width come from which one? T width. T width is how much? 200. Then it will apply that. Width is applied dynamically, na? Okay. Now let's write what is it? Height. Height is equal to how much? T height. T height. It's not working. It says that height cannot bind to height because it is not a property of table. That's what I told you. But height is available as attribute. HTML will work. But dynamically we can't apply. Now we have to tell Angular that, okay, we don't want to apply as a property because we know that there is no property by name height. Use it as attribute. Then we have to use here attr dot height. Now it is fine. This indicates that we know that there is no property by this name. We don't want to bind to property. We want to bind to what? Attribute. We want to bind to attribute. That means now you can see the height is adjusted. Otherwise, it will not work. If you directly write height, it will say that table don't have height. There is no height. So you have to apply to attribute attr and height. Now it is going to work. That is what the concept of attribute binding. Attribute binding is nothing but, so every element don't have all properties that are available as attributes. Then what you do? We have to bind to, that means you have to bind directly to attribute by using the prefix. What is the prefix? attr. That means we have to write like this. Suppose, so public, these two I will copy. So T width and T height, okay? And how you bind this to the table? That means when you design a table, we will put property as what? Width. Width is equal to T width. And here attr dot what? Height. Height is equal to T height. Like this we need to define. Some border is equal to 1. Like this we need to do. If you directly write width, that means you directly write height. Suppose you directly write height, then it will show error. Here we will show error. Error is nothing but height is not a property of what? Table. If it is not a property, what it is? It is an attribute. Then we have to bind to attribute. So one way binding, 3 ways. We can bind using interpolation. We can bind using property. We can bind to attributes. That depends on different elements in HTML. That is why we need to be strong in HTML, because HTML teaches you this is a property, this is an attribute. In HTML, it teaches you that this property is not available as attribute. This attribute is not available as property. That is the reason we need to know all the techniques, where to use interpolation, where to use property, where to use attribute. If it is saying that it is not a property, then immediately use attribute, right? But this is all one technique. What is the technique? One way. Now we will see how two-way works, means how it updates back. For that, some more techniques we need to understand that we'll see in next session tomorrow. Right. In tomorrow's session, we will discuss about how to handle two-way binding. Okay, na? Right.